Welcome back. This is Transitional Justice on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Jay Fidell. Today we're going to talk about corruption and the relationship of corruption to achieving accountability and preventing the undoing of TJ, that's Transitional Justice processes, with Gilbert Nuwagira in Kampala, Uganda. And we're going to be right back to drill down on that discussion. Welcome to the show, Gilbert. It's so nice to see you again. We can't go on meeting like this. What can I say? I'd like to meet you in person one of these days, really soon. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jay, and I'm happy to be here.
So let's talk about corruption and achieving accountability. Let's define our terms first. You know, what is corruption, and what is achieving accountability? And then we'll talk about the relationship and we'll get some examples of how they affect each other.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. I think corruption in simple terms is, cutting corners and, ignoring processes that are stated by law, by policy, and, by existing frameworks, right? And commonly known frameworks. And I would say accountability, on the other hand, is, being able to hold to account to all these processes, the different people who are charged with following them and ensuring that they're following them. And what this does in turn creates, an order, a semblance of order, a semblance of confidence, and people are able to trust processes and able to trust that what has been said is what will be done.
So the common denominator then is trust. The common denominator is confidence in the system.
Absolutely.
It's interesting that there was an article in the Washington Post very recently about corruption in, believe it or not, in Ukraine. And Volodymyr Zelensky is now coming down on corruption there. And the concept is, I know we have a war going on, and my first priority is to deal with this and win the war against Russia. And of course, Transitional Justice and Project Expedite Justice well familiar, with the war in Ukraine. I mean, you guys have people over there. We've talked to them. But what I find interesting is that he's a great leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, and he's able to deal with both of these things at the same time. And he knows there is a relationship between dealing with the corruption and dealing with the war. So it's a parallel to what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary to handle both of those and tackle them almost simultaneously, and particularly for Ukraine, because I think winning the war against the Russian aggression, but losing the internal war will then undermines winning the war against the Russian aggression in the first place. And the way I see it is with our work engaging with farmers and agrarians over in Ukraine, is they have made tremendous losses, and you can imagine what it would mean and how gut-wrenching it would be for them for the support that they would need, and with the reparations and compensations, that's reparations, that's what we call them in transitional justice, that is supposed to come to them, never makes it to them because a corrupt individual has decided to shortcut the process and taken what belongs to these hardworking farmers who have faced the brunt of the conflict and are unable to cultivate their lands, are unable to send their produce to markets. And it's absolutely urgent that much as Ukraine confronts the Russian aggression, it also confronts the internal aggression that is corruption.
It seems like it's even more accentuated in a wartime situation. On the one hand, you have these people who are giving their lives for the war. They're dying. And it's classified about how many. The Ukrainians will tell you how many Russians and how many Russian tanks that they dealt with, but they won't tell you how many fatalities they've had. And so we know there's a lot, and we know that people are dying. And when on the one hand you have people dying, and on the other hand you have people cheating the system, that's an outrage. The other thought that comes to mind, just hearing your comment, is that he's got one hand on the future. He's got the recovery of Ukraine on his mind, and he sees that every day. So yes, you have a war, but you have to recover. You have to put it back together again. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very hard, very expensive, very risky to put it back together again. But he's looking at that early. He's looking at that now because he knows that basic principle that you have to have confidence. You have to have trust in the system, in the government, in the leadership. This is why they call him a good leader. This is why he's one of the great leaders in our time.
Yeah, I think in many ways with Ukraine and with what President Zelensky is doing, there is a great opportunity to shape what post-conflict recovery can look like. There's a great opportunity to redefine and kind of end a cycle of violence from its, past cycle, and be able to, because we are seeing tremendous documentation. I think I could dare say more than in any other conflict. And, there is access to information in terms of the way the different incidents are being documented. And that goes a long way for people to reflect on what has happened and know the truth of what has happened. And for President Zelensky, that is important because then it feeds into the confidence in the system. It feeds into people aiming for recovery and not, going back again and again to the pains of the conflict, and which would then inform, before you know it, there would then be a Ukrainian aggression against Russia, because people are still feeling cheated. People are still feeling like their futures were stolen from them, and they have to fight back to get them. And I think with what President Zelensky is doing, trying to face corruption head on, and kind of making sure as well that yes, we have an ongoing conflict, but we also have to make sure that our systems, our processes are known, are in order, because then that gives Ukrainians world over and the global community hope, and it also gives us confidence that yes, we can work with the Ukrainian population and know that the people who need services, the people who need compensation are receiving what they need when they need it. And that level of confidence goes a long way in rebuilding.
Yeah, it's not just a matter of politics, or for that matter, military engagements. It's a matter of having a big heart and understanding about people, understanding, what drives people. I mean, here's a fellow who wasn't in politics before. He was an entertainer, a comedian even. And it just shows you that in all of us, there is the possibility of leadership. In every one of us, we can find ways to emerge into leadership positions if we concentrate on, the core values. So can you give me a comparison between what is going on there in Ukraine and what we are talking about here? And I suggest that maybe it's about Sudan, South Sudan, and your efforts to try to bring accountability to South Sudan. Can you make a comparison?
Yeah, sure, Jay. I think I work in Sudan and with in South Sudan, particularly with what is happening and the implementation of the comprehensive agreement that was made, is a key issue keeps on emerging is the postponement of elections, and we have seen this in Sudan as well, and we're seeing it in South Sudan, and what that does again is, it nips the trust and the confidence in the system in the bud. When people have just begun to hope, when people have just begun to have a bit of confidence in the system, and then, the leadership announces that, oh no, we are not ready, we are postponing. And we have noticed that there is a pattern when there is that delay, when there is, that postponement, it usually inspires another, spurts of violence here and there within communities, because people are disgruntled. They say, no, you said we were going to do this, and you would work towards, getting all systems go to allow us to do this. So when that doesn't happen, the confidence that the population has in the leadership just, is constantly being, banged at, and it diminishes. And what we are seeing is that it then informs and creates unfortunate cycles of violence, which then impact, whole populations, and, internally displaced persons keep on increasing. And then you have refugees, leaving South Sudan, heading to Uganda. And that whole cycle of instability affects education systems, it affects healthcare, it affects judicial systems, and, crime just spirals out of control. So it has this ripple effect, because, the leadership is not able to, stand up to what it agreed to in the first place. And that then causes and makes conflicts last longer, but also diminishes, the regional mechanisms in place to kind of hold governments to account.
Yeah, to say nothing about the fact that there are migrants crossing the border, and that places a burden on the neighboring countries and communities. And so we see that, as a result of Ukraine too. Help me remember what happened in Sudan. I have a recollection that there was a deal made, and the deal was that for a certain period of time, the junta would run the country, and then the civilian government would run the country, except it was in the other order. First the civilians, then the junta, and the junta found a way to run it first. They turned the deal upside down and ran it first, and then they said, forget the rotation, we're going to stay in power. Is that what happened? Is that what's happening now?
Yeah, in Sudan, it's been evolving rather quickly, but also slowly, in a sense that there is hope that things might be different. Things might just be different, but then things end up being the same. So when the coup happened, there was, a shift, and the resistance councils, were pushing for a change and in governance, and then we got Prime Minister Hamdok come in, and Prime Minister Hamdok had a great start, brilliant man, and he had to make several concessions as well, running sort of alongside the military, and he was sort of given leeway to sort of say what needs to be done, which was going well until then he was, put under house arrest, and there was a mini coup, and then a couple of months later he resigned. And more recently, another agreement was signed with between the military and the civilian leadership, but a good portion of the population, of the resistance councils and of the civilian leadership are saying yes, but this does not hold to account the generals and all the brutality that has been happening as we go through this transition. Now, we know that, a huge part of transitional justice is redress. Yes, we can always think about reform and get systems together, but we have to address what happened. And that is one of the big things that, civil society in South Sudan is trying to call for. It's saying, we need the generals, we need General Burhan, we need Hemti and all the other generals to be held accountable for the crimes that they have been committing, the sexual violence, the killings, and they need to be held to account for all of those. And that is where, arguments like one that just happened in Sudan kind of hung in balance, because then the people in power are not sure they want to be put on the dock, but the people are saying, yes, we need systems to change, we need things to get better, but we cannot just skip over the fact that all these things happen to us. And a critical part of transitional justice is, how do we, address these truth-seeking but also truth-telling processes that allow, communities to feel heard, to say, this is what happened to me at the hands of, the RSF, the security forces, and this is actually what happened to me, and this is what it has caused me, and potentially, if there is a compensation to be given or any other form of justice to be handed out, it can then be handed out if the perpetrator can be traced. But the very act of creating a space where people can say, this is what happened to me, goes a very long way in redressing, right? So it also requires, thinking creatively about, how do we manage transitional justice, and how can these processes look like, right? How can they then shape what the reforms can be? And allowing that, I think, is the thing that will allow Sudan to progress, but also to pave way for South Sudan in and of itself, and Ethiopia to do the right thing and allow accountability, take the lead as they, walk the path of progress.
It's too bad that that these countries are faced with this. You'd think that people would want to get together and all agree that they'd like to make a better life for everybody and that violence is not good for you. And yet it happens. And yet, because it happens, you have to deal with it. And I appreciate, the need to investigate and hold those responsible accountable for, to rebuild the trust and the confidence, of course. One thing that strikes me, though, is that if you have this collective effort to find accountability, and you also have corruption, because corruption comes just as transitions are not necessarily a good thing. I'm beginning to understand what you mean when you say transitional justice. It's justice in a transition, and a transition isn't necessarily a good thing. So when you have this question of finding accountability and dealing with crimes against humanity in various ways, you also have the possibility that the transition creates a kind of chaotic environment. And the chaotic environment allows for the development of corruption. Corruption grows in chaos, and corruption at the same time stands as an obstacle to accountability. Can you describe the relationship between all of those factors on the chessboard?
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. I think you're spot on. Corruption grows in chaos, and corruption, feeds the chaos in and of itself. How can I put it? I think I will then sort of reflect a little bit on DRC, the Congo, and jump back to Sudan and South Sudan. We do see, places and areas and regions that have been in conflict for so long, right? It's the perfect environment for that breeds lawlessness, because then, systems have fallen apart, justice systems have fallen apart. There's no way of following up on anything, on a case. Education systems have fallen apart, healthcare systems, and everyone is trying to get by, right? And what that means is that, the police officer or the army officer who's supposed to do their job will be asking for a bribe, or will be, trying to, unjustly get something because they have a gun, right? And at the end of the day, that, creates a cycle of conflict. And we're seeing this in DRC, we're seeing this in South Sudan and in Sudan, because the person who has the gun has some form of power, right? And on the other end, then when it comes to, being able to seek accountability, then you find the person who has the gun, the person who has the power is reluctant, because they know what they did to be able to get to that position. So then again, you find that you're in this situation where corruption has sort of been, sort of feeding the dragon, so to speak, and, kind of sort of creating this infinite loop of violence, because the systems are not in place. Therefore, people are able to take advantage of the system, and because people are able to take advantage of the system, it is further aggravated. And yes, do we get a point where we have sort of like a radical stop and shift, and that is where institutions like the African Union, like the Intergovernmental Authority, come in to sort of say, we are coming together as a region, as countries, and we're literally asking the citizens of Sudan to trust Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and South Sudan, and say, this is what we are going to hold your government account to. But that is supposed to inspire confidence in the citizens. But what happens when this confidence is then again and again destroyed by the government, when they say, oh yeah, the requirements to do what they told us to do have not yet been met, but that means we have to push for another 6 months or a year to be able to have election. On paper, it is rational, it makes sense, but ultimately you have a population that is yearning for justice, that is yearning to move beyond violence, to move beyond the mass atrocities that have happened to them, but they are being let down again and again because of corruption. So then you have this infinite loop that keeps going on and on and on.
Yeah. So, where do you start? It's like pinning a blanket. Which corner do you go to first? Do you start with the corruption, or do you start with making a civil society, or do you start with accountability? You start with stopping the violence. I mean, there's so many things that a leader or a leading group, I mean, a moral, a moral positive leadership group would have to do. What's the priority in terms of waking up in the morning and looking out at the society and dealing with these problems? Which one comes first, or do they all come at the same time?
Yeah, I think the question of whether are they simultaneous or consecutive, I think it makes me reflect on President Zelensky's approach, and I think you start by recognizing that there are two wars happening simultaneously, really, and everyone ought to know that corruption affects me ultimately. If someone decides to take a bribe, they are they are doing something against themselves. They are crippling their own system. They are literally trying to disable themselves and prevent themselves, from progressing. And so looking at that in the broader picture, and I think that is the message that every person, every citizen ought to know, that taking a bribe, yes, the systems are broken right now, but taking a bribe will have a ripple effect that will further aggravate the situation. So I am better off trying to make things work. and on the violence front, I think that is something that also ought to be, be being dealt with. And I'm thinking, I'm extrapolating with the case of Ukraine particularly. When the aggression is coming, you need to be able to deal with that. But also, if you don't deal with the corruption, that is a sort of open gateway for the aggression as well. So you have to find a balanced approach and make sure that the citizenry knows the impact of corruption on their own systems and on their own livelihoods, on generations to come. And so to take it very seriously and approach it with absolute caution, and have tighter systems in place to be able to make things work for everyone.
That sounds like accountability. I mean, it's the same kind of accountability, except it's right here at home. And I see that Zelensky has the problem of, he's got people, deserting on the battlefield, spying for the Russians, doing all kinds of atrocities themselves. And then he's got the people who are engaging in corrupt activities. And he's got to find a way to fairly hold all of their feet to the fire. And it's a different problem if you're dealing with corruption, because you're not necessarily spying, you're not necessarily engaging in, physical, violations of human rights, but you're undermining, the effort to do that. And there was one story in this article I mentioned about how, this is interesting, one of his officials, close up to the top, was able to borrow a car from, quote, an oligarch. And I'm not sure what that means in the context of Ukraine. We know there are oligarchs in Russia, but did we know there are oligarchs in Ukraine too? It's possible. I would have to research that. So he was able to borrow this car and take his family for a vacation. Imagine a vacation in Spain now, in the middle of a war. Now, that's not necessarily cash corruption, but it's corruption. And he's, I think Zelensky fired him, but query whether he needs to take other steps to make it clear that this is not acceptable. And so you have to have a scale of accountability for the inside corruption also, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think accountability kind of goes in both directions and internally. And if you have a great yardstick, great systems in place that are trusted and that people are seeing them to work, then that level of confidence then inspires people to live up to those standards, and that goes a long way in creating space for redress and reform, for different communities and regions and countries like Ukraine.
So we talk about spiral, and we talk about this spiraling effect lasting much longer than we would have wished. You and I have been talking for a couple of years, actually. We're both getting older, Gilbert, and the spiral goes on. Where does it come to an end? Assume you can pin down all the corners of the blanket, and that you can, make traction on both ends of this, on the corruption end and on the accountability end, and on building good institutions and government and public trust. Where does it come to an end? You've been on this beat now in I guess East Africa, South Sudan for a long time, and you've been watching Congo and other places, and query, where do you see it ending? Where do you see the cycle coming to an end?
Yeah, that's a very rich question, and I think it's a great way for us to reflect on the impact of corruption and how it affects accountability. I think probably a conversation on its own because it's loaded as well. But I think it ends in good governance. And what does that look like for this region, for East Africa, for Sudan, for South Sudan? It means that you have functioning democracies. What do functioning by functioning, I mean not just a democracy where you have elections and leaders are elected into power, but the systems leading up to that are in shambles. Yes, the election worked, but wait a minute, how was the selection? How did you get to that, election? I think when I say functioning, when you get to a functioning democracy that people know in absolute confidence, these are the leaders that we have in place, because these are the systems that we agreed upon, and this is what they've given us. And these are the rules, the constitution, and the international instruments that we have signed up to as a country, that we are held to account. And I think the functioning, having that good governance where, judicial systems are able to fit into governance systems and are able to fit into social and by social I mean healthcare and education systems, and that functionality, and I think is what would lead us to, a place beyond corruption.
I would like to think that democracy is the answer. Of course, we have seen situations with benign despots who were able to, do leadership, but truly democracy is the answer. And I recall that early on in our coverage of South Sudan, the people were in the streets by the hundreds of thousands, and they were peaceful. There was peaceful protest. And if you talk to them, they would say, we want to do peaceful protest. All of a sudden, the military had guns and was shooting them. And it didn't, the peaceful part of that didn't last very long. And so you have a kind of cycle down, and the social compact, if you will, was broken. So I think at that moment, when they were out there in the streets calling for peaceful protest and peaceful respect for the social compact, that was a moment that could have resulted in a solution. Okay, but it fell apart. How do you prevent it from falling apart? At that moment, they were looking for something they could trust. And they all believed, all these hundreds of thousands of people believed they could find that if only they would be respected for their protest. I'm not really giving you a good question, but I guess my question is, how do you stop it from spiraling from a point of trust to a point of untrust?
Yeah, how do we get leaders that are really, really connected to the people, to the issues, and have an understanding of what the everyday person goes through and experiences, and do not forget that, right? How do you get to leaders that have their citizens at their heart? How do you get leaders that have gone through it? And maybe this might be getting, people like President Zelensky, who have, been comedians and have done the work and have interacted with the people, understand the issues. And maybe this might be meaning, getting, politicians to, get down to their communities and serve with them and understand them better, and have spaces where they actively engage with them, but are not just, in capital cities and making decisions without, even consulting their constituents. And maybe it's, getting politicians to actually drive on these roads and know that the roads are actually bad. I think for me, it comes down to, how do you get politicians and people in governance to have a heart for the people? How do we get them to have a heart for what what people are going through in terms of the institutions, in terms of, you know, healthcare, the education. How do you get them to feel that? I think that would get us, beyond corruption, straight into good democracy, and yeah.
Let me ask you a hard question. And maybe we're coming to the end of the show now, but a hard question. It seems to me that the media is a very important factor in all of this. I will assume that in South Sudan, as most across the sub-Saharan Africa, there are smartphones and there are computers, and that people look at social media and they connect that way. And sometimes that's positive, and sometimes it's not positive. But isn't there a role for the media to play to make people and leaders understand, their obligations as members of a democratic society?
Yeah, I think absolutely the media has a very, very important role to play in shaping how people understand their role in society. And but the media, like, I think that's a too that's a very it's a very sharp sword, because then the media quite often, as we have seen, has been either state regulated, or it is pursuing the interests of a singular individual. But absolutely, I think if the media can portray in real time what the actual issues are and provide analysis that um, analysis that allows the citizens to reflect carefully and say, okay, this is what we are facing. These are the governance processes, and so that citizens can also have an understanding of what processes are in place. And that goes a long way as well in kind of shifting how societies behave, and it goes along in a long way in affirming the social compact. And yeah, I mean, I read one of the newspapers in the region. It's the East African, which sort of has a regional coverage. And when you look, usually when I look at headlines of different newspapers, I know you can tell what the issues are in a place and how they are being addressed. And quite often, in some of the dailies in Uganda, you will read the headlines and you'll say, okay, I know this is the issue in the country, but clearly we are being diverted to something else. And when you see something like that, it is usually heartbreaking, because that we have a national hospital that is breaking down, but that doesn't make the news. But what makes the news is a show that got cancelled because of rain. And so I think media plays a significant role in affirming the social compact, in allowing people to see and offering information for people to be able to make informed decisions. And I do believe that goes a long way in informing transitional justice, because people then get to say what their truth is, and they're able to say, this is where we actually need redress, and this is where we need reform, which I think are very core to transitional justice in and of itself.
We live in transitional times. It isn't limited to your neck of the woods. It seems like it's everywhere, and democracy is so fragile. You can have what appears to be a democratic government, and a very short time later, the institutions of your democratic government can come apart. We've seen problems like that in the U.S. And another article of some concern was Benjamin Netanyahu's attempt to corrupt the Israeli court system, the judicial system, right, happening right now. And it just shows you that there's not a great difference between a place in the world which has atrocities and a place in the world that could have atrocities. This is the lessons you are learning, Gilbert, are global, and they apply pretty much everywhere, or could apply. Well, thank you very much, Gilbert. I always enjoy our discussions. I hope we get a chance to do this again soon, and I wish you well in all particulars.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.